The wind howled through the narrow canyon like a banshee, carrying with it the scent of pine and the promise of an early winter storm. Ruth Wood pressed herself deeper into the shallow cave she had found, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid mountain air. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar companion these past 3 weeks since she had fled the settlement below. At 55, she had never imagined she would find herself alone in the wilderness. But life had a way of stripping away all illusions of security. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling the sharp edges of her ribs through the fabric of her worn dress. The cruel words of the townspeople still echoed in her mind like a relentless drumbeat. Fat Ruth, they had called her when times were good and food was plentiful. Now, after weeks of near starvation, her body had begun to consume itself, leaving her gaunt and hollow-eyed. The irony was not lost on her that she had finally achieved the slender figure society demanded, only to find herself cast out and forgotten. The storm was approaching faster than she had anticipated. Dark clouds rolled over the peaks like a gray blanket, and the temperature was dropping with each passing hour. Ruth knew she would not survive another night exposed to the elements. Her fire had died hours ago, and she had no more kindling dry enough to coax flames from her precious remaining matches. The cave provided some shelter, but it was shallow and offered little protection from the driving wind that seemed determined to find every gap in her meager defenses. She thought of her small house in the valley below, now occupied by strangers who had paid the bank what she could not. Everything she had worked for, everything that had defined her existence, had been stripped away in a matter of months. First, her husband had died in the mine collapse. Then the debts had mounted faster than she could manage on her seamstress wages. The final blow had come when the new mine foreman, David Wright, had made it clear that her services were no longer welcome in town. Too old, too set in her ways, too much of a reminder of harder times that the growing settlement wanted to forget. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video in the comments. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through her dark reverie like a knife. Ruth pushed herself against the back wall of the cave, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had heard stories of the mountain men who lived in these remote areas, tales that ranged from heroic to terrifying, depending on who was telling them. Some said they were dangerous outlaws hiding from the law. Others claimed they were hermits driven mad by isolation. None of the stories suggested that encountering one would end well for a woman alone. The hoofbeats stopped somewhere below her hiding place. Ruth held her breath, straining to hear over the wind. A man's voice drifted up to her, low and rough from disuse. Gary Brooks had been tracking the storm for 2 days, reading the signs in the sky and the behavior of the wildlife with the skill of a man who had spent the better part of 15 years learning to survive in these unforgiving mountains. At 60, he had long ago accepted that he would live and die alone in this wilderness, and the prospect no longer troubled him as it once had. Solitude had become his companion, silence his closest friend. But something was different today. His horse, a sturdy mare named Belle, who had been with him for 8 years, kept looking toward the rocky outcropping ahead, with ears pricked forward in a way that suggested she sensed another presence. Gary trusted the animal's instincts more than his own aging senses. In country like this, such trust often meant the difference between life and death. He dismounted near a cluster of boulders and ground-tied Belle, knowing she would not wander far. The storm would be upon them within the hour, and he needed to find adequate shelter for both himself and his horse. He had been heading for a cabin he maintained higher up the mountain, but the approaching weather had forced him to reconsider his route. As he moved through the rocks, searching for a suitable windbreak, he caught sight of something that made him pause. Footprints in a patch of soft earth, small and narrow, made by someone wearing worn boots that had seen better days. The tracks were recent, made within the last few hours, and they led directly toward the cliff face ahead. Gary followed the trail with the patience of a hunter, his weathered face showing no emotion as he read the story the tracks told. Whoever had made them was moving slowly, perhaps weakened by hunger or injury. The stride was uneven, suggesting exhaustion or illness. Most telling of all, the person had been seeking shelter, just as he was. He found the cave without difficulty, noting the cold ashes of a small fire at its mouth and the disturbed earth that spoke of someone trying to make themselves comfortable in an uncomfortable place. The cave was occupied, but by someone who posed no immediate threat. Gary had learned to distinguish between the hiding places of desperate people and the lairs of dangerous ones. Ruth watched through a gap in the rocks as the stranger approached her hiding place. He was tall and lean, with graying hair that hung past his shoulders and a beard that spoke of months without the attention of scissors or razor. His clothes were practical and well-maintained, the garb of someone who lived by his wits and his knowledge of the land. He moved with the careful confidence of a predator, but there was something in his manner that suggested he was not hunting her specifically. When he stopped at the mouth of her cave and looked directly at her hiding spot, Ruth knew that concealment was no longer possible. She had two choices: remain hidden and hope he would move on, or reveal herself and face whatever consequences might follow. The approaching storm made the decision for her. She could not survive the night alone, and this man, whatever his intentions, represented her only chance of living to see another dawn. She emerged from the shadows slowly, keeping her hands visible and her movements non-threatening. The man studied her with eyes the color of winter sky, taking in her condition with a glance that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance. Ruth felt suddenly conscious of how she must look, gaunt and dirty, her hair hanging in lank strands around her face. Gary Brooks had seen many desperate people in his years in the mountains. Prospectors who had lost everything chasing dreams of gold. Settlers who had misjudged the harshness of the land. Outlaws fleeing justice who had found something worse than the law in the wilderness. But the woman standing before him was different. There was a dignity in her bearing despite her obvious hardship, a strength that had not been broken by whatever circumstances had brought her to this desolate place. She was older than most of the refugees he encountered, probably in her 50s, with the kind of face that spoke of a life lived with purpose before misfortune had intervened. Her clothes, though worn and dirty, had once been well made, and her hands showed the calluses of honest work rather than the soft weakness of pampered living. Nobody wants that, he thought, remembering the cruel dismissal he had heard directed at people like her in the settlements below. Society had a way of discarding those who no longer fit its narrow definitions of useful or desirable. He had been on the receiving end of such judgment himself when younger men had made it clear that his presence in town was no longer welcome. "I am 60 and lonely," he admitted to himself, though he would never speak such words aloud. The admission carried no self-pity, only the recognition of a simple truth. Perhaps they were both refugees from a world that had decided they had outlived their usefulness. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, striking the rocks around them with increasing frequency. Gary made his decision quickly, as he had learned to do when survival was at stake. "We need shelter," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. "This cave will not be enough for what is coming. There is a better place higher up, but we need to move now before the trail becomes impassable." Ruth studied his face, searching for signs of deception or threat. She found neither. What she saw instead was the calm competence of a man who had faced storms before and survived them. More importantly, she saw no judgment in his eyes, no contempt for her circumstances or appearance. In a world that had made it clear she was unwanted, such neutrality felt like a gift. "I have nothing to offer you," she said, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "No payment, no skills that would be of use to someone like you. I am just a burden you would be better off leaving behind." Gary considered her words for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "Burden is something you carry because you have no choice," he replied. "I am offering you a choice. You can come with me and live through this storm, or you can stay here and die. The mountain does not care which you choose, and neither do I. But I will not leave you here to die when I can prevent it." The rain was falling harder now, and the wind was beginning to howl through the rocks with increasing fury. Ruth looked at the approaching storm, then back at the man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had been afraid to voice. She had spent 3 weeks learning to survive on her own, but she was not too proud to recognize when she needed help. "I will come with you," she said, gathering her few possessions quickly. "But I want you to know that I understand what you are risking by helping me. If the weather turns worse, if I slow you down, you must not hesitate to leave me behind. I will not have your death on my conscience, along with everything else I have lost." Gary was already moving toward his horse, his actions speaking louder than words about his intentions. He helped Ruth climb onto Belle behind him, noting how light she had become and how her hands shook with more than just cold. The woman was closer to the edge of survival than she probably realized, but she still had enough strength left to make the journey if they moved quickly. The trail up the mountain was treacherous under the best of conditions, but with the storm beginning in earnest, it became a test of nerve and skill that would challenge even Gary's considerable experience. The wind drove the rain horizontally across the exposed sections of the path, and the temperature continued to drop as they climbed higher into the thin mountain air. Ruth clung to Gary's back as Belle picked her way carefully along the narrow ledges, her hooves finding purchase on rocks that seemed barely wide enough to support her weight. The woman had never been comfortable on horseback, and the combination of fear, exhaustion, and hunger made the journey feel like a waking nightmare. But she forced herself to remain alert, knowing that any mistake could send all three of them tumbling into the abyss that yawned beside the trail. As they climbed, Gary found himself thinking about the woman behind him and the circumstances that had brought her to such desperate straits. He had heard enough stories from other mountain dwellers to recognize the pattern. The settlements in the valley below were growing and changing, becoming less tolerant of those who did not fit their vision of progress and prosperity. Older people, especially women without family to protect them, were often the first to be pushed aside when resources became scarce or when new leadership decided to remake their communities. He had experienced something similar himself 15 years earlier, when a new mine supervisor had made it clear that Gary's services as a tracker and guide were no longer needed. Too old, too set in his ways, too much of a reminder of the rough frontier past that the town wanted to leave behind. The dismissal had stung at the time, but Gary had come to see it as a liberation. The mountains had taught him lessons about survival and self-reliance that no settlement could offer. The cabin appeared through the driving rain like a mirage, its solid log walls and steep roof promising shelter from the storm that was now raging with full fury. Gary had built the structure himself over the course of 2 summers, choosing the location carefully for its protection from the prevailing winds and its access to fresh water from a spring that never ran dry. He helped Ruth down from the horse and guided her quickly to the cabin door, then led Belle to a small shelter he had constructed for her protection. The mare would be comfortable enough with hay and grain he kept stored there, and she was hardy enough to weather the storm without difficulty. Inside the cabin, Ruth stood dripping in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sudden transition from the chaos of the storm to the quiet warmth of shelter. The single room was spartanly furnished but meticulously maintained, with everything in its proper place and serving a clear purpose. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with seasoned wood stacked neatly beside it. A simple table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the room, while a narrow bed was tucked into one corner. Gary moved with practiced efficiency, building a fire and setting water to heat, while Ruth stood motionless, still processing the fact that she was safe and warm for the first time in weeks. The flames caught quickly, filling the room with dancing light and the comforting crackle of burning wood. "Sit," Gary said, indicating one of the chairs. "You need to get warm and dry before hypothermia sets in. I have dry clothes that will fit you well enough, and food that will help restore your strength." Ruth sank into the chair gratefully, feeling the warmth from the fire begin to penetrate her chilled bones. She watched as Gary moved about the cabin, preparing simple but nourishing food with the same careful attention to detail she had observed in everything else he did. There was something deeply comforting about his presence, a sense of competence and reliability that she had not encountered in a very long time. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally, her voice stronger now that she was beginning to warm up. "You do not know me, do not owe me anything." Most people would have ridden past without stopping. Gary paused in his preparations, considering the question seriously. "Because I know what it is like to be discarded," he said finally, "to be told that you no longer have value, that the world would be better off without you. I know what it is like to be 60 and lonely, to realize that everyone you once knew has either died or forgotten you exist." He resumed his work, adding vegetables to the pot of soup he was preparing. "I also know that survival in country like this requires more than just individual strength," he continued. "It requires recognizing when cooperation serves everyone better than competition. You may think you have nothing to offer, but you are wrong. Experience has value, even if the world below has forgotten that truth." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at his words, the first tears she had allowed herself since fleeing the settlement. For weeks, she had told herself that she was strong enough to survive alone, that she did not need anyone else to validate her worth or ensure her survival. But the truth was that she had been slowly dying, not just from hunger and exposure, but from the crushing weight of isolation and rejection. "I was a seamstress," she said quietly, staring into the flames. "I made clothes for the wives of mine supervisors and merchants, took pride in my work, in my ability to support myself after my husband died. But when the new foreman arrived, he made it clear that my services were no longer needed. Too expensive, he said, when younger women would work for less and complain less about working conditions." She paused, gathering her thoughts and her courage. "I tried to find other work, but word spreads quickly in a small town. Soon no one would hire me for anything, not even washing clothes or cleaning houses. The bank foreclosed on my home, and the new owners made it clear that I was not welcome to remain in town. So I left, thinking I could make my way to the next settlement and start over." Gary ladled soup into a bowl and set it before her, along with thick slices of bread he had baked himself. "Eat slowly," he advised. "Your stomach needs time to adjust after going without proper food for so long." Ruth took a tentative sip of the soup, savoring the rich flavor and the warmth that spread through her body. It was the first hot meal she had eaten in more than 2 weeks, and she had to force herself to follow Gary's advice about eating slowly when every instinct screamed at her to devour the food as quickly as possible. The storm raged outside for 3 days, trapping them together in the small cabin, while wind and rain lashed the mountains with unprecedented fury. During those days, Ruth began to understand the man who had saved her life with a clarity that surprised her. Gary Brooks was not the dangerous hermit of local legend, nor was he the broken man she had initially assumed him to be. He was simply someone who had chosen a different path when society had made it clear he was no longer welcome on the conventional one. He was methodical in everything he did, from maintaining his equipment to preparing meals to caring for his horse. There was a rhythm to his days that spoke of hard-won wisdom about what was necessary for survival and what was merely comfortable luxury. He wasted nothing, valued everything that served a purpose, and found contentment in the simple act of living according to his own terms. Ruth found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking, trying to understand how he had achieved such apparent peace with his circumstances. At 60, he was still strong and capable, his body hardened by years of physical labor and outdoor living. But more than that, there was a calmness about him that suggested he had made peace with his choices and their consequences. On the second day, when the storm showed no signs of abating, Gary began teaching her practical skills she would need if she intended to survive in the mountains. He showed her how to maintain a fire efficiently, how to preserve food for long-term storage, how to read weather signs and animal behavior for clues about changing conditions. Ruth proved to be an apt student, her years of detailed work as a seamstress having given her steady hands and patience for learning new techniques. She discovered that many of the skills she had developed in her previous life translated surprisingly well to her current circumstances. The same attention to detail that had made her an excellent seamstress served her well when learning to prepare medicines from wild plants or to mend equipment with limited materials. More importantly, she began to see herself differently. Instead of a discarded woman with no value, she started to recognize that she possessed knowledge and abilities that had worth in this new context. Her experience managing a household on limited resources, her skill with needle and thread, her ability to organize and plan, all of these had applications in mountain living that she had not previously considered. Gary watched her transformation with something approaching admiration. Many people who found themselves in desperate circumstances became bitter or broken, but Ruth was discovering strength she had not known she possessed. She asked intelligent questions, learned quickly, and adapted to hardship with a resilience that spoke well of her character. On the third morning, the storm finally began to break, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow and ice. The world outside the cabin was pristine and beautiful, but also more dangerous than it had been before the weather changed. The trail down the mountain would be treacherous for weeks, possibly impassable until spring arrived to melt the accumulated snow. Ruth stood at the cabin window, looking out at the winter wonderland that had become her prison, and realized that she faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could ask Gary to help her reach the lower elevations when travel became possible, could try to make her way to another settlement and attempt to rebuild her old life. Or she could stay in the mountains and learn to live by the rules of this harsh but honest environment. The choice was complicated by her growing awareness of Gary himself and the unexpected connection that had developed between them during their enforced isolation. He had treated her with a respect and consideration she had almost forgotten existed, had seen value in her when the rest of the world had written her off as worthless. More than that, she had begun to see past his gruff exterior to the loneliness that drove his solitary existence. "We are both refugees," she thought as she watched him splitting wood outside the cabin. "Both discarded by a world that values youth and conformity over experience and wisdom. Perhaps that gives us something in common that could form the foundation for something more than mere survival." But even as the thought formed, Ruth recognized the dangers inherent in such thinking. Gary had saved her life and shown her kindness, but that did not mean he wanted or needed a permanent companion. He had chosen solitude deliberately, had built a life that depended on self-reliance and independence. She would be foolish to assume that a few days of forced proximity had changed his fundamental nature or desires. Gary, for his part, was wrestling with his own conflicted feelings about the woman who had unexpectedly entered his carefully ordered world. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten how much easier certain tasks became when shared with another competent person. Ruth's presence had brought an efficiency to daily routines that he had not anticipated, and her questions about his methods had forced him to examine and explain practices he had long taken for granted. More troubling was his growing awareness of her as a woman rather than simply another refugee in need of assistance. She was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of youth-obsessed society, but there was something compelling about her combination of strength and vulnerability, her determination to learn and adapt despite the losses she had suffered. He found himself listening for her voice when she spoke, watching for her smile when something pleased her, noticing the graceful way she moved despite her recent hardships. Such thoughts were dangerous for a man who had convinced himself that he needed no one and wanted nothing more than the solitude he had cultivated for 15 years. The sound of approaching riders shattered the peaceful morning like a gunshot, sending both Gary and Ruth to the window to peer down the mountain trail. Three men on horseback were picking their way carefully up the treacherous path, their progress slow but determined despite the hazardous conditions. Gary recognized the lead rider immediately and felt his jaw tighten with tension. David Wright, the mine foreman who had made Ruth's life in the settlement unbearable, was coming up the mountain with two companions who looked like the kind of men hired for their willingness to use violence rather than their mining skills. Ruth gasped when she saw Wright's face, her hand flying to her throat in an involuntary gesture of fear. She had hoped that leaving the settlement would end his harassment, but apparently he was not content to simply drive her away. He wanted something more, though what that might be, she could not imagine. Gary moved away from the window and began checking his weapons with the calm efficiency of a man who had faced dangerous situations before. He had two rifles, a shotgun, and a pistol, all well maintained and loaded. More importantly, he knew the terrain around his cabin intimately and could use that knowledge to his advantage if the situation turned violent. "Why would he come all this way?" Ruth asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "What could he possibly want from me that would justify such a dangerous journey?" Gary finished his preparations and turned to face her, his expression grim but determined. "Some men cannot stand the thought that someone they have wronged might escape their control," he said. "They see it as a challenge to their authority, a suggestion that their power has limits. Wright strikes me as that kind of man." He moved to the door, then paused and looked back at Ruth. "Whatever happens, you stay inside unless I tell you otherwise," he said. "These mountains have their own rules about hospitality and conflict, and Wright is about to learn what it means to threaten someone under my protection." Ruth watched through the window as Gary stepped outside to meet the approaching riders, his posture relaxed but ready, like a wolf prepared to defend its territory. She realized that the next few minutes would determine not just her immediate safety, but the entire course of her future life. The storm had passed, but a different kind of tempest was about to break over the peaceful mountain cabin. David Wright reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin, his cold eyes surveying the scene with the calculating gaze of a predator sizing up potential prey. The two men flanking him were cut from rougher cloth than the typical mine workers Ruth remembered from the settlement. Ralph Ortiz sat his saddle with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to violence, his hand resting casually near the pistol at his hip. The third man, whom Ruth did not recognize, had the lean, hungry look of a wolf in winter. Gary stepped forward, slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, but Ruth could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his right hand remained close to the rifle he carried. The mountain wind had died to a whisper, leaving an unnatural stillness that seemed to amplify every sound, from the creak of saddle leather to the nervous snorting of the horses. "Right," Gary said, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "Long way to come for a social visit, especially with the trails in their current condition." "What brings you up here?" The mine foreman dismounted with theatrical slowness, making a show of stretching his back and examining his surroundings. He was a man who understood the value of intimidation through casual displays of confidence, and he clearly intended to establish dominance in this remote confrontation. "Heard you might be harboring a fugitive, Brooks," Wright replied, his tone conversational but edged with menace. "Woman by the name of Ruth Wood. She owes money to some important people in the settlement, and they are getting impatient about collecting what is owed to them." Gary did not move, but Ruth saw his grip tighten almost imperceptibly on his rifle. She knew he was calculating distances, angles, cover options. The knowledge that he was preparing for violence on her behalf filled her with a mixture of gratitude and terror. "No fugitives here," Gary said simply. "Just a woman seeking shelter from the storm. Last I checked, that was not a crime in these mountains." Wright smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Everything is a crime if the right people say it is," he replied, "and the right people are saying that Ruth Wood needs to come back to the settlement to face her responsibilities. We are here to make sure that happens." Ruth pressed herself against the cabin wall beside the window, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the men outside could hear it. She had fled the settlement with nothing but the clothes on her back, had owned nothing of value that anyone could possibly want. What debt could Wright be talking about? And why would he risk such a dangerous journey to collect it? The answer came to her with sickening clarity as she remembered the conversation she had overheard between Wright and the bank president just before her eviction. They had been discussing the mineral rights to various properties in the area, including the small plot of land where her house had stood. Someone had discovered something valuable beneath the ground she had once called home, and Wright needed her signature on documents to complete whatever scheme he had devised. She thought of the papers she had refused to sign during those final days in the settlement, documents that Wright had claimed were merely formalities related to her eviction. Now she understood that those papers had been something far more significant. Legal instruments that would have transferred her rights to any minerals found beneath her former property. Her refusal to cooperate had apparently cost Wright and his associates a considerable amount of money. Gary seemed to sense her realization, though he kept his attention focused on the three men arrayed before him. The mathematics of the situation were simple and brutal. Three armed men against one, with an innocent woman caught in the middle. In a fair fight, Gary would have reasonable odds of survival, but Wright had not traveled this far for a fair fight. "I will ask you once more to leave," Gary said, his voice carrying a finality that made the horses shift nervously. "Miss Wood is under my protection, and she will remain so until she chooses otherwise. If you have legal business with her, you can conduct it through proper channels when she returns to civilization." Wright laughed, a sound like breaking glass in the mountain air. "Legal channels?" he repeated. "You have been up here too long, Brooks. You seem to have forgotten how the world actually works. We are the legal channels now, at least as far as Miss Wood is concerned." He gestured to his companions, who began spreading out to flank the cabin. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, the positioning of men who intended to control all avenues of escape. Ruth realized with growing horror that Wright had not come to negotiate or even to intimidate. He had come to take what he wanted by force. Gary recognized the tactical situation as clearly as Ruth did, but his options were limited by his determination to protect her. He could not retreat to the cabin without exposing his back to Wright's men, and he could not advance without leaving Ruth vulnerable to anyone who might circle around behind the building. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, each man waiting for someone else to make the first move that would shatter the fragile peace. Ruth found herself holding her breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether she lived to see another sunset or died in the snow outside Gary's cabin. Then Wright made his mistake. Perhaps it was overconfidence, or perhaps it was simply the arrogance of a man accustomed to having his way through intimidation rather than skill. He reached for his pistol with the casual assumption that Gary would not dare to resist three armed men. Gary's rifle came up with the smooth precision of long practice, the barrel centering on Wright's chest before the mine foreman could clear leather. The sound of the hammer being cocked seemed unnaturally loud in the mountain stillness. "Do not," Gary said quietly. "The next man who moves toward a weapon will be the first to die." Wright froze with his hand halfway to his gun, finally understanding that he had misjudged the situation and the man he was trying to intimidate. Gary Brooks was not some broken hermit who could be bullied into submission. He was a survivor who had spent 15 years learning to defend himself and his territory against all threats. Ralph Ortiz had his own weapon half drawn when Gary's gaze shifted to him with the cold intensity of a winter storm. The hired gun was fast, but he was not faster than a bullet from a rifle that was already aimed and ready to fire. He slowly raised his hands and stepped back, recognizing that this was not the easy intimidation job he had been promised. The third man, however, was either braver or more foolish than his companions. He had managed to work his way around to the side of the cabin while Gary's attention was focused on Wright, and now he thought he saw an opportunity to end the confrontation with a single shot. His pistol cleared its holster with practiced the barrel swinging toward Gary's exposed flank. Ruth saw the movement through the window and reacted without conscious thought, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Gary, to your right." Gary spun with fluid grace, his rifle tracking toward the new threat even as the man's pistol fired. The bullet whined past Gary's head, close enough that Ruth could see him flinch from the passage of the slug. But Gary's return shot was true, catching the gunman center mass and dropping him into the snow with a finality that left no room for doubt. The sound of the shots echoed off the mountain peaks like thunder, rolling away into the distance before fading into an ominous silence. Wright stared at his fallen companion with the shocked expression of a man who had just realized that his carefully planned intimidation had become a life-or-death struggle. Gary swung his rifle back toward Wright, working the lever action to chamber a fresh round with mechanical precision. The message was clear. The next shot would not be a warning, and there would be no second chances for anyone foolish enough to test his resolve. "You have a choice to make, Wright," Gary said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "You can take your remaining man and ride back down the mountain. Or you can join your friend in the snow. But you will not take Miss Wood anywhere against her will." Wright looked at the body in the snow, then at Ralph Ortiz, who was carefully keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. The mine foreman's face was pale with shock and rage, but he was not so far gone as to throw his life away in a futile gesture of defiance. "This is not over, Brooks," he said through gritted teeth. "You think you can hide up here forever? But these mountains will not protect you when winter really sets in. We will be back, and next time we will bring enough men to finish this properly." Gary did not lower his rifle as Wright and Ortiz mounted their horses and began the treacherous journey back down the mountain trail. He watched until they disappeared around a bend in the path, then continued watching for another 10 minutes to make sure they were not planning an immediate ambush. Only when he was satisfied that the immediate threat had passed did he allow himself to relax slightly. But even then, he kept his rifle ready as he approached the body in the snow to confirm that the man was dead and posed no further danger. Ruth emerged from the cabin on unsteady legs, her face pale but her eyes bright with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. She had never seen a man killed before, had never been present during an act of violence more serious than a tavern brawl. The reality of it was both more and less than she had expected, brutal in its finality, but somehow less dramatic than the stories she had heard. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing that the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. "You risked your life for someone you barely know. Someone who has brought nothing but trouble to your door." Gary was checking the dead man's pockets, searching for anything that might tell them more about Wright's plans or the people backing him. He found a considerable amount of money, more than a simple hired gun would normally carry, along with a letter bearing the seal of the territorial government. He read the letter quickly, his expression growing more grim with each line. When he finished, he looked up at Ruth with eyes that held a mixture of anger and concern. "It is worse than I thought," he said, handing her the letter. "Wright is not acting alone, And this is not just about mineral rights. Someone with real power wants you back in the settlement, and they are willing to use official channels to make it happen. Ruth read the document with growing horror. It was a warrant for her arrest, signed by a territorial judge and charging her with theft of property belonging to the mining company. The charges were obviously fabricated, but they carried the weight of law and would give Wright legal justification for whatever he chose to do in the name of bringing her to justice. More troubling still was the date on the warrant. It had been issued 3 days before Wright's arrival at the cabin, which meant that he had been planning this confrontation for some time. The storm had delayed his arrival, but it had not deterred him from his ultimate goal. "They mean to take me back no matter what it hits," Ruth said, her voice hollow with the realization of how desperate her situation had become. "Even if you killed all of them today, more would come. They will not stop until they have what they want." Gary studied the warrant more carefully, noting the names and seals that gave it official weight. He recognized some of the signatures, territorial officials who were known to be friendly to mining interests and hostile to individual property rights. The web of corruption extended far beyond Wright himself, reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. "What do they really want from you?" he asked. "This is not about money or even mineral rights. Men like Wright do not risk their lives for simple business disputes. There is something else, something that makes you valuable enough to justify this kind of effort." Ruth sank into one of the chairs by the fire, her mind racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of information she had gathered over the past few months. There had been strange visitors to the settlement, men in expensive clothes who spoke in whispers with Wright and the other mine supervisors. There had been surveying crews working in areas that had never shown promise for mineral extraction. Most telling of all, there had been the sudden urgency to acquire property rights from longtime residents who had never before been pressured to sell. "I think I know," she said slowly, the pieces of the puzzle finally beginning to form a coherent picture. "There were rumors in the settlement before I left. Stories about a new kind of mining operation that required large amounts of land and water rights. Not gold or silver, but something else. Something that the government wanted badly enough to override individual property claims." She looked up at Gary with eyes that reflected both fear and determination. "My husband worked in those mines for 20 years before the accident that killed him. He used to tell me stories about the strange rock formations they sometimes encountered, formations that the supervisors always ordered them to avoid or cover up. He thought they were hiding something valuable, but he never lived long enough to find out what it was." Gary nodded grimly, understanding beginning to dawn in his weathered features. The territorial government had been making noises about strategic mineral reserves, resources that were considered vital to national security and therefore subject to federal seizure if necessary. If Ruth's property sat on top of such a deposit, her signature on the right documents could transfer ownership to interests that extended far beyond the local mining company. "Coal," he said quietly, "or maybe something even more valuable. The kind of thing that makes men rich and governments powerful. The kind of thing that makes individual rights disappear when they become inconvenient." The implications were staggering. If Gary was right, then Ruth was not just fighting for her freedom or her dignity. She was standing in the way of forces that had the power to crush anyone who opposed them. Forces that would not hesitate to use violence or legal manipulation to achieve their goals. The fire crackled in the silence that followed Gary's revelation, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls as both of them contemplated the magnitude of what they were facing. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up again, whistling through the peaks with a mournful sound that seemed to echo their growing sense of isolation and vulnerability. Gary rose and began pacing the small confines of the cabin, his mind working through the tactical implications of their situation. Wright would be back, probably with more men and better preparation. The warrant gave him legal cover for whatever violence he chose to employ, and the backing of territorial authorities meant that resistance would be painted as criminal behavior rather than self-defense. "We need to leave," he said finally, his voice heavy with reluctance. "This cabin has been my home for 8 years, but it has become a trap. Wright knows where to find us, and he has the resources to mount a siege that we cannot survive." Ruth felt a stab of guilt at the thought of Gary abandoning his carefully built sanctuary because of her troubles, everything he had worked to create, The life he had carved out of the wilderness through years of patient effort was being destroyed because he had chosen to help a desperate woman he barely knew. "I cannot ask you to give up everything for me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life, and I will always be grateful for that. But I will not be responsible for destroying yours in return. Help me get to the next settlement, and I will face whatever comes on my own." Gary stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression stern but not unkind. "You still do not understand," he said. "There is no next settlement that will be safe for you. No place within the territory where Wright's warrant will not give him the authority to take you. And even if there were, I would not abandon you to face this alone." He moved to the window and peered out at the darkening sky, noting the signs of another storm building on the horizon. The weather that had been their enemy might now become their ally, providing cover for an escape that would otherwise be impossible. "There is a place," he continued, his voice thoughtful as he formulated a plan. "North of here, across the territorial border, there are settlements that do not recognize warrants issued by corrupt judges. It is a hard journey, especially in winter, but it might be our only chance of finding sanctuary beyond Wright's reach." Ruth joined him at the window, looking out at the forbidding landscape that stretched away toward the distant peaks. The journey Gary was proposing would be dangerous under the best of circumstances, potentially fatal in winter conditions. But the alternative was to remain trapped in a cabin that Wright could surround and starve them out of whenever he chose. "How long would such a journey take?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "3 weeks, maybe 4 if the weather turns bad," Gary replied honestly. "We would have to travel light and fast, staying ahead of any pursuit while dealing with mountain passes that are barely passable in good conditions. It would be the hardest thing either of us has ever done." Ruth thought of the weeks she had already spent struggling to survive in the wilderness, of the hunger and cold and constant fear that had been her companions since fleeing the settlement. The journey Gary described would be worse, but it would also offer something her current situation did not: hope. "When do we leave?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Gary smiled for the first time since Wright's arrival, an expression that transformed his weathered features and revealed the man he had been before solitude and hardship had carved lines of caution around his eyes. "Tonight," he said, "Wright will not expect us to travel in darkness, and the storm that is coming will cover our tracks. By the time he returns with reinforcements, we will be days ahead of any pursuit." They spent the remaining hours of daylight preparing for a journey that would test every skill and resource they possessed. Gary selected only the most essential supplies, balancing the need for warmth and sustenance against the requirement for speed and mobility. Every ounce of weight would matter on the treacherous trails ahead, and excess baggage could mean the difference between life and death. Ruth proved surprisingly adept at the practical preparations, her years of managing a household with limited resources serving her well as she helped organize their meager possessions. She discarded everything that was not absolutely necessary, keeping only the clothes on her back and a few items that might prove useful in the wilderness. As darkness fell and the first flakes of snow began to drift down from the overcast sky, Gary led Belle out of her shelter and began loading their supplies onto the sturdy mare. The horse seemed to sense the urgency of their situation, standing quietly while Gary secured their packs and checked every strap and buckle twice. Ruth took one last look around the cabin that had been her sanctuary, memorizing details that she might never see again. The simple furniture, the carefully tended fireplace, the books that spoke of Gary's hunger for knowledge and connection to the wider world. It was a home built by a man who had found peace in solitude, and she felt the weight of responsibility for its abandonment. Gary seemed to understand her thoughts as he joined her in the doorway, his own gaze lingering on the space that had sheltered and sustained him through 8 long winters. "A place is just wood and stone," he said quietly. "Home is something you carry with you, something that exists wherever you choose to make your stand. This cabin served its purpose, but that purpose is finished now." He closed the door firmly behind them and did not look back as they led Belle into the swirling snow. The storm was intensifying rapidly, which would make their journey more difficult, but would also provide the concealment they desperately needed. Wright's men would not be able to track them in such conditions, giving them precious hours to put distance between themselves and their pursuers. The trail north was little more than a game path, barely visible even in good weather and completely obscured by the falling snow. Gary navigated by memory and instinct, following landmarks that were invisible to Ruth, but clear as signposts to his experienced eyes. The horse picked her way carefully through the treacherous footing, her breath forming clouds of vapor in the frigid air. Ruth walked beside Gary, conserving Belle's strength for the steeper climbs ahead, while fighting to keep pace despite her exhaustion and the hampering effects of the deep snow. The cold bit through her inadequate clothing with savage intensity, and she found herself wondering how long she could maintain this pace before hypothermia claimed her. Gary seemed to sense her struggle without her having to voice it. He adjusted their route to take advantage of every windbreak and shelter the terrain offered, and he called frequent halts to check on her condition and ensure that she was not pushing herself beyond her limits. During one such rest, huddled against a boulder that provided some protection from the driving wind, Ruth found herself studying Gary's profile in the dim light that filtered through the storm clouds. There was something different about him now, a sense of purpose and energy that had been absent during their quiet days in the cabin. The prospect of danger had awakened something in him that years of peaceful solitude had allowed to sleep. "You are enjoying this," she said, not accusingly, but with a note of wonder in her voice. Gary considered her words for a moment before responding. "Not enjoying," he said finally, "but I had forgotten what it felt like to have something worth fighting for, something that mattered more than mere survival. It has been a long time since my choices affected anyone but myself." The storm reached its full fury as they climbed higher into the mountains, transforming the world around them into a whitewashed nightmare of wind and snow. Visibility dropped to mere yards, and the trail disappeared entirely beneath accumulating drifts that grew deeper with each passing hour. Gary was forced to navigate by compass and dead reckoning, trusting to his knowledge of the terrain to keep them moving in the right direction. Ruth's world contracted to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, of maintaining the rhythm that would keep her alive in the face of conditions that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to challenge them. Her feet had gone numb hours ago, and she could no longer feel her fingers despite the thick mittens Gary had insisted she wear. But she pressed on, driven by a determination that surprised her with its intensity. The horse was suffering too, her normally steady gait becoming labored as she struggled through snow that sometimes reached her belly. Gary was forced to break trail ahead of her, using his own body to create a path that Belle could follow. The effort was exhausting for all of them, but it was the only way to maintain forward progress in the increasingly difficult conditions. They had been traveling for 6 hours when Gary called a halt beside a cluster of pine trees that offered some protection from the wind. Ruth collapsed against one of the massive trunks, her chest heaving as she fought to catch her breath in the thin mountain air. Every muscle in her body ached, and she was not sure she had the strength to continue. Gary unloaded a small tarp from Belle's pack and rigged a crude shelter against the trees, creating a space barely large enough for the two of them to huddle together out of the worst of the storm. He produced a small alcohol stove and began heating water for tea, the simple ritual of warmth and sustenance taking on profound significance in their desperate circumstances. "Drink this," he said, handing Ruth a cup of steaming liquid that tasted like salvation itself. The warmth spread through her body like liquid fire, bringing feeling back to her extremities and clearing some of the fog from her exhausted mind. "How much farther?" she asked, though she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Gary consulted his compass and studied the terrain visible through the swirling snow. "We have covered perhaps 8 miles, he said. "We need to reach the pass before dawn, or we risk being caught in the open when Wright comes looking for us." 8 miles. Ruth tried to calculate how much farther they had to travel and felt her heart sink at the magnitude of the distance that still lay ahead. In good conditions, 8 miles would have been a pleasant afternoon walk. In a blizzard, at night, through mountain terrain that challenged even experienced travelers, it felt like an impossible journey. But Gary was already breaking down their temporary shelter, his movements efficient despite the obvious exhaustion that lined his features. He helped Ruth to her feet and checked her extremities for signs of frostbite, nodding with satisfaction when he found that she was still in reasonably good condition. "The hardest part is still ahead," he warned her as they resumed their trek. "The pass is narrow and exposed, with no shelter if the wind picks up. Once we start the final climb, we cannot stop until we reach the other side." Ruth nodded her understanding, though privately she wondered if she had the strength for what Gary was describing. Her legs felt like lead, and each step required a conscious effort of will that seemed to drain more of her dwindling reserves. But she had come too far to give up now, had endured too much to surrender to exhaustion within sight of potential safety. The trail grew steeper as they approached the pass, winding back and forth across the face of the mountain in a series of switchbacks that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. The snow was deeper here, and the wind howled with a ferocity that threatened to knock them from the narrow path. Belle was struggling now, her breathing labored, and her movements increasingly unsteady. Gary was forced to lead her carefully around each turn, testing the footing before committing their weight to ground that might not support them. One wrong step would send all three of them tumbling into the abyss that yawned beside the trail. Ruth found herself thinking about the life she had left behind, the comfortable routine that had defined her existence before Wright's harassment had driven her into the wilderness. The warm house, the steady work, the predictable rhythm of days that held no surprises and few challenges. It seemed like another person's life now, a dream of security that had been revealed as an illusion when tested by real adversity. But she also thought about the woman she was becoming, the person who had emerged from the ashes of her old life like a phoenix rising from flames. She was stronger now, more capable than she had ever imagined possible. The soft seamstress who had once feared to venture outside her own neighborhood had died somewhere in the wilderness, replaced by someone who could face a blizzard and a dangerous journey without flinching. The pass appeared ahead of them like a gap torn in the fabric of the world, a narrow notch between towering peaks that offered the only route through the mountain barrier. The wind funneled through the opening with tremendous force, creating a howling maelstrom that seemed determined to prevent their passage. Gary paused at the entrance to the pass, studying the conditions with the careful attention of a man whose life depended on making the right decision. The wind was strong enough to knock a person down, and the snow was blowing horizontally across the opening with enough force to strip the skin from exposed flesh. "We go now, or we do not go at all," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "The storm is getting worse, and if we wait, we will be trapped on this side until spring." Ruth looked at the hellish landscape ahead and felt fear claw at her throat. The pass looked like the entrance to some frozen underworld, a place where human beings were not meant to venture. But behind them lay Wright and his men, and ahead lay the possibility of freedom. She nodded her agreement, and Gary led Belle into the teeth of the storm. The passage through the mountain gap was a nightmare of wind and cold that tested every limit of human endurance. The trail was barely visible beneath the driving snow, and the wind was so strong that they had to lean into it to avoid being blown off the narrow path. Ruth could not see more than a few feet ahead, and she followed Gary by touch and sound, trusting him to guide them through the chaos. Halfway through the pass, Belle stumbled and went to her knees, her strength finally overcome by the combination of exhaustion and brutal conditions. Gary immediately moved to help the horse regain her footing, but Ruth could see that the animal was near collapse. They had pushed her beyond her limits, and she might not have the strength to complete the journey. Gary made a decision that Ruth knew must have cost him dearly. He began unloading the horse's pack, discarding supplies that they needed but could not afford to carry if Belle was to survive. Food, extra clothing, tools that might mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness ahead. All of it was abandoned in the snow to lighten the burden on their faithful companion. With the reduced load, Belle was able to continue, though her pace was now little more than a stumble. Ruth found herself supporting part of the horse's weight, her own exhaustion forgotten in the face of the animal's distress. They were all in this together now, three living creatures united in their determination to survive against impossible odds. The far side of the pass appeared gradually through the swirling snow, a blessed relief from the howling wind that had threatened to tear them apart. But even as they descended into the relative shelter of the northern slopes, Ruth knew that their troubles were far from over. They had crossed the territorial border, but they were still days from any settlement that might offer true sanctuary. Gary led them to a sheltered grove where they could rest and recover from their ordeal. Belle was in poor condition, her breathing labored and her legs trembling with exhaustion. Ruth was little better, her body pushed beyond its limits by the brutal journey through the pass. But they had made it. Against all odds, they had crossed the mountain barrier that separated them from Wright's immediate reach. It was a victory of sorts, though Ruth knew it was only the first of many challenges they would face in the days ahead. Dawn broke gray and cold over the northern slopes, revealing a landscape that was both beautiful and forbidding in its pristine wilderness. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds in the weak morning sunlight. But the beauty came with a price, as the new snow made travel even more difficult and left tracks that any competent tracker could follow. Gary studied their back trail with the practiced eye of a man who had spent years reading sign in the wilderness. The storm had covered most of their passage through the lower elevations, but their route through the pass would be clearly visible to anyone who knew where to look. Wright would be able to follow them, though the dangerous conditions would slow any pursuit and give them a precious head start. Belle was in better condition after a night's rest, though Gary could see that the mare was still feeling the effects of their brutal journey. He checked her hooves carefully for signs of injury and was relieved to find that she had suffered no permanent damage from the ordeal. With careful nursing, she would be able to continue their journey, though they would have to moderate their pace to avoid pushing her beyond her limits again. Ruth emerged from the crude shelter they had constructed, her face pale but determined. The night had been brutally cold, and she had slept little despite her exhaustion. But she was alive, and that was more than she had dared hope for when they had entered the pass the night before. "How far to the nearest settlement?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Gary consulted his mental map of the region, calculating distances and travel times based on the current conditions. 2 days, maybe 3 if the weather turns bad again, he replied. "There is a trading post at the confluence of 2 rivers about 40 miles north of here. The man who runs it, Andrew Sanchez, is someone we can trust." The mention of another person who might help them filled Ruth with a hope she had not felt since their flight began. For so long it had seemed that the entire world was aligned against them, that every human being they might encounter would be either an enemy or a threat. The possibility of finding an ally, someone who might offer sanctuary or assistance, was like a light in the darkness. But first they had to reach this trading post, and 40 miles through mountain wilderness in winter was a journey that would test every skill and resource they possessed. Gary began redistributing their remaining supplies, making hard choices about what was essential and what could be abandoned to save weight and increase their speed. Ruth watched him work, noting the careful attention he paid to every detail of their preparations. There was something almost ritualistic about his movements, as if the act of organizing their meager possessions was a form of prayer or meditation that helped him focus his mind on the challenges ahead. "You have done this before," she observed, not asking a question, but stating a fact. Gary paused in his packing and looked at her with an expression that held both sadness and resignation. "Different mountains, different reasons," he said quietly. "But yes, I have run for my life before. It was how I learned to survive up here in the first place." Ruth wanted to ask for details, to understand what had driven him to seek refuge in the wilderness years before. But she could see that the memories were painful ones, and she respected his privacy enough not to press for information he was not ready to share. Instead, she focused on helping him prepare for their continued journey, learning to think like a fugitive who must balance speed against caution, necessity against comfort. Every decision carried weight, and every mistake could prove fatal in the unforgiving environment they were traversing. They set out as soon as the sun was high enough to provide adequate light, following a route that Gary had scouted during the early morning hours. The trail was little more than a suggestion, a faint track that wound through dense forest and across open meadows where the snow lay deep and unmarked by human passage. The pace Gary set was sustainable but demanding, designed to cover maximum distance while conserving their strength for the long journey ahead. Ruth found herself falling into the rhythm of wilderness travel, her body adapting to the constant motion and her mind learning to focus on the immediate demands of navigation and survival. As they traveled, Gary shared his knowledge of the land they were crossing, pointing out landmarks and explaining the subtle signs that indicated water, shelter, or potential danger. Ruth proved to be an eager student, her quick intelligence and practical nature making her an apt pupil for lessons that could mean the difference between life and death. The first day passed without incident, though Ruth was acutely aware of their vulnerability to pursuit. Every sound in the forest made her heart race, every distant movement caught her eye and held her attention until she could identify its source. The knowledge that Wright and his men might be following them added a constant undercurrent of tension to their journey. They made camp that night in a sheltered valley where a small stream provided fresh water and the surrounding hills offered protection from the wind. Gary built a small, smokeless fire using techniques that would make their presence difficult to detect from a distance. The warmth was minimal, but it was enough to heat their simple meal and provide psychological comfort in the vast darkness of the wilderness. Ruth sat beside the fire, staring into the flames and thinking about the journey that had brought her to this point. 3 weeks ago, she had been a settled woman with a home and a trade, someone who worried about mundane things like rent payments and social gossip. Now she was a fugitive in the wilderness, dependent on the kindness of a man she barely knew, and facing an uncertain future in a foreign land. But she was also discovering strengths she had never known she possessed, capabilities that had been hidden beneath years of conventional living. The woman who had once feared to venture outside her familiar neighborhood was now crossing mountain ranges in winter and facing dangers that would have terrified her former self. Gary seemed to sense her thoughts as he settled beside her, his weathered face thoughtful in the firelight. "You are not the same person who sought shelter in that cave 3 weeks ago," he observed. "That woman was broken by circumstances beyond her control. This woman is choosing her own path, regardless of the obstacles." Ruth considered his words, recognizing the truth in them, even as she struggled to understand how such a transformation had been possible. "I do not feel stronger," she admitted. "I feel afraid most of the time, uncertain about everything except the need to keep moving forward." "Fear is not weakness," Gary replied. "Fear is what keeps you alive when you are facing real danger. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to act despite the fear. And you have shown more courage in the past few weeks than most people display in a lifetime." His words warmed her more than the fire, providing a kind of validation she had not realized she needed. For so long, she had measured herself against the expectations of others, had allowed their judgments to define her worth and capabilities. Now she was learning to trust her own instincts and to value her own assessment of her abilities. The second day brought new challenges as they descended into lower elevations, where the snow was less deep but the terrain was more complex. The forest was denser here, with fallen trees and rocky outcroppings that forced frequent detours and slowed their progress. Gary had to constantly adjust their route to find passable ground for Belle, whose condition remained a source of concern. But the lower altitude also brought signs of human habitation, distant smoke from fires, and the occasional glimpse of cleared land that spoke of settlements somewhere ahead. Ruth felt her spirits lift at these evidences of civilization, even as she reminded herself that not all human contact would be friendly or safe. Late in the afternoon, they encountered their first real test of the new territory they had entered. A group of 3 men on horseback appeared on the trail ahead, their presence blocking the most direct route to their destination. Gary immediately led Ruth and Belle into the cover of the surrounding forest, where they could observe the strangers without being seen. The men were clearly not casual travelers. They were well-armed and alert, their eyes scanning the forest with the practiced wariness of people who expected trouble. Their leader was a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. The other 2 flanked him with military precision, their hands never straying far from their weapons. Gary studied them carefully, reading the subtle signs that would tell him whether these men represented a threat or an opportunity. Their clothes were practical but well-made, their equipment properly maintained, their horses healthy and well cared for. These were not desperate outlaws or casual bandits, but they were also not ordinary settlers going about peaceful business. After several minutes of observation, Gary made a decision that surprised Ruth. He stepped out of concealment and raised his hand in greeting, his rifle held in a non-threatening position, but ready for instant use if the situation turned hostile. "Good afternoon," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I am Gary Brooks, and I am traveling north with a companion. We mean no harm and seek no trouble with anyone." The leader of the group studied Gary with sharp eyes that missed nothing, taking in his appearance, his equipment, and the way he held himself. After a moment that seemed to stretch forever, the man smiled and urged his horse forward. "Gary Brooks," he said, his voice carrying a note of recognition. "I heard you might be heading this way. I am William Lee, and these are my associates. We have been waiting for you." Ruth felt her blood turn to ice at the man's words. If these men had been waiting for them, It could only mean that Wright had somehow got 10 yard ahead of their escape and arranged for them to be intercepted. Their desperate flight through the mountains had been for nothing, and they were about to be captured despite all their efforts and sacrifices. But Gary did not seem alarmed by Lee's statement. Instead, he relaxed slightly and moved closer to the mounted men, his manner suggesting familiarity rather than fear. "Andrew sent you," Gary said, and it was not a question. Lee nodded, his smile becoming more genuine. "Got word yesterday that you might be coming this way with a lady who needed help. Andrew thought you could use some escort for the final stretch, especially with certain people asking questions about strangers in the area." Ruth felt relief wash over her like a physical force, leaving her weak-kneed and grateful for the tree she was leaning against. These men were not rights agents but allies, sent by the mysterious Andrew Sanchez to ensure their safe arrival at the trading post. Gary turned and beckoned for Ruth to join them, his expression reassuring despite the wariness that never completely left his eyes. She emerged from the forest slowly, still uncertain about trusting strangers despite Gary's apparent confidence in these men. "Miss Wood, I presume," Lee said, touching his hat in a gesture of respect. "Andrew sends his compliments and his assurance that you will find sanctuary at his establishment. But he also wants you to know that your pursuers are not far behind, and we need to move quickly if we are to stay ahead of them." The confirmation that Wright was indeed following them sent a chill through Ruth that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She had hoped that the difficult passage through the mountains might have discouraged pursuit, but apparently Wright's determination was stronger than the obstacles in his path. "How far behind?" Gary asked, his voice tight with concern. Lee consulted a pocket watch, his expression grim. 6 hours, maybe 8 if they are being cautious about the trail conditions. They have more men now, at least a dozen from what our scouts report. And they are carrying a warrant that gives them authority to cross territorial boundaries in pursuit of a fugitive. The news that Wright had expanded his force was troubling enough, but the revelation that he had legal authority to continue his pursuit across territorial lines was devastating. Ruth had hoped that crossing the border would put her beyond his reach, but apparently his connections extended further than she had realized. "Then we need to move," Gary said, already turning toward Belle and beginning to check her gear. "How far to Andrew's place?" 2 hours if we push hard," Lee replied. "But the lady's horse looks like she has been through hell. Will she make it?" Gary examined Belle carefully, noting the signs of exhaustion and stress that marked her condition. The mare had given everything she had to get them this far, but asking her to maintain a hard pace for another 2 hours might be more than she could manage. "She will make it," he said finally, though Ruth could hear the doubt in his voice. "She has to." Lee seemed to understand the situation without further explanation. He dismounted and began redistributing supplies among the horses, lightening Belle's load as much as possible while ensuring that nothing essential was left behind. His men followed suit without being asked, their actions speaking of long experience with emergency situations. The final approach to Andrew Sanchez's trading post was a race against time and exhaustion that pushed all of them to their limits. Belle struggled gamely to maintain the pace, but Ruth could see that the mare was running on courage alone, her strength depleted by the demands of their long journey. Ruth herself was little better, her body protesting every step as they pressed through forest and meadow toward the sanctuary that lay somewhere ahead. Only the knowledge that Wright and his men were closing in behind them kept her moving when every muscle screamed for rest. The trading post appeared suddenly through the trees, a cluster of log buildings situated beside a river that sparkled in the late afternoon sunlight. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Ruth could see people moving about the compound with the purposeful activity of a thriving business operation. Andrew Sanchez emerged from the main building as they approached, a man in his 50s with the weathered features of someone who had spent his life on the frontier. His greeting was warm but urgent, his eyes already scanning the trail behind them for signs of pursuit. "Welcome to my home," he said, helping Ruth down from Belle's back. "You are safe here, but we needed to get you inside quickly. There are men asking questions in settlements to the south, and they will not be far behind." Ruth felt tears of relief prick her eyes as she realized that their desperate flight had finally brought them to genuine sanctuary. But even as Andrew led them toward the safety of his buildings, she could not shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Wright had shown a determination that bordered on obsession, and she doubted that even territorial boundaries would stop him from pursuing his goals. The next few hours would determine whether their escape had been successful or whether they had simply delayed the inevitable confrontation that Wright seemed determined to force upon them. Andrew Sanchez guided Ruth and Gary through the main building of his trading post, past shelves lined with supplies and equipment that spoke of a thriving business serving the scattered settlements of the Northern Territory. The interior was warm and welcoming, with a large fireplace that cast dancing shadows on walls decorated with maps and photographs of the surrounding wilderness. Lisa Sanchez emerged from a back room, wiping her hands on an apron that bore the evidence of meal preparation. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. Her smile was genuine as she took in Ruth's bedraggled appearance, and Ruth felt herself relax slightly under the older woman's motherly attention. "You look like you could use a hot meal and a proper bed," Lisa said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had spent years caring for travelers and refugees. "Andrew, get these people settled while I finish preparing dinner. We can discuss business after they have had time to recover from their journey." But even as Lisa spoke, Andrew was moving to the windows, checking the approaches to his compound with the practiced eye of a man who had survived on the frontier by never letting his guard down completely. His expression was grim as he studied the darkening landscape beyond his buildings. "I wish we had more time," he said quietly. "But Williams' scouts report that your pursuers are less than 2 hours behind you now. They have been pushing hard despite the difficult conditions, and they are carrying enough supplies to sustain a prolonged siege if necessary." Ruth felt her heart sink at the news. She had allowed herself to hope that crossing the territorial border might provide genuine sanctuary. But Wright's determination seemed to know no bounds. The man was willing to risk his life and the lives of his men to pursue her across hundreds of miles of dangerous wilderness. "What options do we have?" Gary asked, his voice steady despite the tension that lined his weathered features. Andrew spread a hand-drawn map on the table before them, pointing to various locations marked with symbols that indicated settlements, trails, and natural landmarks. His finger traced a route that led north from the trading post toward a series of peaks that dominated the horizon. "There is a mining camp about 20 miles north of here," he said. "The men who work there are not fond of territorial authorities, and they have little love for mining companies that send armed men to intimidate honest folks. If you can reach them, they will provide protection and help you disappear into country that Wright will never be able to search effectively." Ruth studied the map, noting the difficult terrain that lay between the trading post and the mining camp. The route Andrew was suggesting would take them through some of the most challenging wilderness in the territory, country that would test every skill they had developed during their escape from the settlement. But Gary was already nodding his agreement with Andrew's assessment. "It is our best option," he said. "Wright expects us to continue running north toward the main settlements. He will not anticipate us turning deeper into the mountains where the mining camps operate." Andrew moved to a cabinet and began pulling out supplies, selecting items with the efficiency of a man who had equipped many desperate travelers over the years. Food, ammunition, warm clothing, and tools that could mean the difference between survival and death in the wilderness ahead. "Take what you need," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who understood the stakes involved. "Lisa and I have been helping people like yourselves for 15 years. We know what it takes to disappear in this country when disappearing becomes necessary for survival." Ruth watched the preparations with a mixture of gratitude and growing dread. These people were risking their own safety to help strangers, and she knew that Wright would not hesitate to take his anger out on anyone who had assisted in her escape. The web of consequences from her flight was expanding to encompass innocent people who deserved better than to be caught up in her troubles. "I cannot ask you to endanger yourselves for me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have already done more than anyone could reasonably expect. If Wright discovers that you helped us, he will make you pay for your kindness." Lisa looked up from the pack she was filling with medical supplies, her expression fierce despite her gentle demeanor. "Some things are more important than safety," she said firmly. "We have seen what men like Wright do to people who cannot defend themselves. If we do not stand against such behavior, we become complicit in it through our silence." Her words carried the weight of experience, and Ruth realized that she and Gary were not the first refugees to seek sanctuary at this remote trading post. Andrew and Lisa Sanchez had made their home a beacon of hope for people fleeing injustice and oppression, and they would not be deterred by threats or intimidation. The sound of approaching horses shattered the evening quiet, sending everyone in the room into immediate action. Andrew moved to the window and peered out at the trail that led to his compound, his expression growing grim as he counted the riders who were approaching through the gathering darkness. 12 men, he reported quietly, all armed, all looking like they mean business. Wright is with them, along with several others I do not recognize. They are moving with the confidence of people who believe they have legal authority on their side. Gary checked his weapons one final time, his movements automatic despite the tension that filled the room. Ruth could see that he was calculating odds and options, preparing for a confrontation that could easily turn deadly for everyone involved. But Andrew was already implementing a plan he had obviously used before in similar situations. He moved to a section of the floor near the back wall and pulled up what appeared to be ordinary floorboards, revealing a hidden passage that led beneath the building. Emergency exit, he explained tersely. It leads to the riverbank about 100 yards downstream from here. There is a canoe hidden in the brush that will carry 2 people and basic supplies. You can be miles away before Wright realizes you are not trapped in this building. Ruth stared at the dark opening in the floor, understanding that it represented her only chance of escaping the net that was closing around them. But the thought of abandoning Andrew and Lisa to face Wright's anger filled her with guilt that threatened to paralyze her ability to act. "What about you?" she asked. "Wright will not simply accept that we escaped. He will demand answers, and he will not be gentle in obtaining them." Andrew smiled grimly, his hand moving to a shotgun that hung above the fireplace. "Lisa and I have been dealing with men like Wright for longer than you might think," he said. "We know how to handle ourselves, and we have friends in this territory who do not appreciate outsiders who threaten peaceful business operations." The sound of voices outside was growing louder as Wright and his men approached the main building. Ruth could hear the mine foreman's distinctive tone, arrogant and demanding, as he prepared to assert his authority over people who owed him nothing and feared him less than he assumed. Gary was already moving toward the hidden passage, his pack sword and his weapons ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. But he paused at the opening and looked back at Andrew and Lisa with an expression that conveyed more gratitude than words could express. "We will not forget this kindness," he said simply. "If there is ever anything we can do to repay your generosity, you have only to ask." Andrew nodded, his attention already focused on the confrontation that was about to unfold in his trading post. "Just stay alive," he replied. "That will be payment enough for what we have done here tonight." Ruth followed Gary into the narrow passage, her heart heavy with the knowledge that good people were about to face danger because of her troubles. The tunnel was cramped and dark, barely wide enough for one person to crawl through at a time, but it represented freedom, and she forced herself to move forward despite her fear and guilt. Behind them, she could hear the sound of Wright's men surrounding the building, their voices carrying through the thin walls as they prepared to search for their quarry. The confrontation was about to begin, and Ruth could only pray that Andrew and Lisa would emerge from it unharmed. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever through the darkness, its rough walls pressing close on either side as Ruth and Gary made their way toward the riverbank. The sound of voices from the trading post grew fainter with each yard they covered, but Ruth could still hear the angry tones that indicated Wright was not pleased with whatever answers Andrew was providing. They emerged from the tunnel into a tangle of brush and fallen logs that provided excellent concealment from anyone watching the river. The canoe was exactly where Andrew had promised, a sturdy craft that looked capable of handling the swift current and rocky obstacles that characterize mountain streams. Gary loaded their supplies quickly, his movements efficient despite the urgency of their situation. The river would carry them away from immediate danger, but it would also take them into wilderness that few people had ever explored. They would be trading the known threat of Wright's pursuit for the unknown dangers of uncharted territory. Ruth settled into the front of the canoe, gripping her paddle with hands that trembled slightly from exhaustion and adrenaline. She had never navigated whitewater before, but Gary's confidence in her abilities gave her the courage to face this new challenge. She had already proven to herself that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. The current caught them immediately, pulling the canoe into the main channel with a force that took Ruth's breath away. The water was icy cold and moved with the relentless power of snowmelt from the peaks above. Gary steered from the stern with practiced skill, reading the water ahead and calling out instructions that Ruth followed with growing confidence. Behind them, the lights of the trading post grew smaller and dimmer until they were lost entirely in the darkness. Ruth felt a pang of loss as the sanctuary disappeared from view, but she also felt a surge of hope as the river carried them toward an uncertain but potentially brighter future. The journey downstream was a test of nerve and skill that demanded complete attention to the immediate challenges of navigation and survival. The river twisted and turned through rocky gorges where the walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, creating a natural corridor that seemed designed to hide travelers from unwanted observation. Gary proved to be as skilled with a paddle as he was with everything else, guiding their canoe through rapids and around obstacles with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning to read the moods and dangers of mountain streams. Ruth found herself trusting his judgment completely, following his instructions without question even when they seemed to lead directly into danger. Hours passed in a blur of cold spray and aching muscles as they made their way through country that few human beings had ever seen. The river carried them deeper into the wilderness, away from the settlements and roads where rights authority might have some meaning. Here, in this pristine landscape of stone and water, different rules applied. Dawn found them in a quiet backwater where the river had carved a small bay surrounded by towering pines. Gary guided the canoe to shore and helped Ruth climb out on legs that shook with exhaustion and cold. They had covered perhaps 20 miles during the night, putting significant distance between themselves and their pursuers. But even as they made camp in the shelter of the trees, Ruth knew that their flight was far from over. Wright had shown a determination that bordered on obsession, and she doubted that even the difficult river journey would be enough to discourage him from continuing his pursuit. Gary seemed to share her concerns as he studied their back trail with the practiced eye of a man who had spent years avoiding unwanted attention. The river would slow Wright's men, but it would not stop them entirely. Sooner or later, they would find a way to follow, and when they did, Ruth and Gary needed to be prepared for whatever confrontation might result. "We need to reach the mining camp before Wright figures out which direction we went," Gary said as he began checking their supplies. "The miners Andrew mentioned will provide protection, but only if we can get to them before we are cornered in open country." Ruth nodded her understanding, though privately she wondered how much more running she could endure. Her body was approaching the limits of what it could sustain, and she could see that Gary was feeling the effects of their prolonged flight as well. They were both operating on reserves of strength and determination that could not last indefinitely. But they had come too far to give up now, had endured too much to surrender when sanctuary might be within reach. Ruth forced herself to stand and begin preparing for the next stage of their journey, drawing on inner resources she was still discovering she possessed. The trail to the mining camp led through country that was even more rugged than what they had already traversed. Gary consulted the rough map Andrew had provided, noting landmarks and calculating distances with the careful attention of someone who understood that navigation errors could prove fatal in such remote territory. They set out as soon as they had rested enough to continue safely, following a path that was little more than a suggestion carved by generations of wildlife moving between feeding and watering areas. The going was slow and treacherous, with loose rock and steep grades that tested their endurance and sure-footedness. Ruth found herself thinking about the woman she had been before this ordeal began, the settled seamstress who had measured her days by the familiar routines of domestic life. That person seemed like a stranger now, someone whose concerns and fears belonged to a different world entirely. The woman who was climbing this mountain path had been forged by hardship and tested by dangers that her former self could never have imagined. But she had also discovered capabilities and strengths that had been hidden beneath years of conventional living. She could navigate wilderness trails, survive on minimal food and shelter, face armed men without flinching, and make decisions that affected not just her own survival, but the safety of others. The transformation was profound and irreversible. Gary watched her progress with something approaching admiration, noting how she had adapted to challenges that would have broken many people. The frightened woman who had sought shelter in his cave weeks ago had evolved into someone who could be trusted as a partner in the situations where trust was literally a matter of life and death. The mining camp appeared suddenly through the trees, a cluster of rough buildings and equipment that spoke of serious industrial activity in this remote location. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Ruth could hear the sounds of human activity that indicated the camp was actively occupied. But Gary approached cautiously, his weapons ready and his senses alert for any sign that Wright might have anticipated their destination. The miners Andrew had described might be allies, but they were still strangers whose loyalties and motivations remained unknown. A bearded man emerged from one of the buildings as they approached, his clothes and hands bearing the evidence of hard physical labor. His eyes were sharp and intelligent as he studied the two travelers who had appeared at his remote outpost. "You would be the folks Andrew sent word about," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I am Thomas Mitchell, foreman of this operation. Andrew says you need help with some territorial authorities who do not understand the concept of boundaries." Gary nodded, recognizing a kindred spirit in the gruff mining supervisor. "We have men following us who claim legal authority to take Miss Wood back to answer fabricated charges," he explained. "They have been pursuing us for days, and they do not seem inclined to give up easily." Mitchell spat into the dirt, his expression showing what he thought of territorial authorities and their legal claims. "We do not recognize much legal authority up here," he said bluntly. "This is working country, and we handle our own problems in our own way. Anyone who wants to cause trouble for folks Andrew vouches for will find themselves facing more opposition than they bargained for." His words carried the confidence of a man who was backed by others equally determined to maintain their independence from outside interference. Ruth felt a surge of hope as she realized that they might finally have found genuine sanctuary among people who were willing and able to stand up to Wright's intimidation. But even as Mitchell spoke, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the forest surrounding the mining camp. Wright had found them again, his persistence finally paying off as he closed in on his quarry. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Ruth knew that this time there would be no escape routes or hidden passages to save them. Wright and his men emerged from the forest like a military unit, their formation disciplined and their weapons prominently displayed. The mine foreman had brought his full force to bear on this final confrontation, clearly intending to end the pursuit once and for all. His face was grim with determination as he surveyed the mining camp and counted the opposition he would face. Thomas Mitchell stepped forward to meet the approaching riders, his own men appearing from various buildings around the camp, with the casual efficiency of people accustomed to dealing with unwelcome visitors. Ruth counted at least 15 miners, all armed and all looking like men who had spent their lives doing dangerous work in dangerous places. The two groups faced each other across the open space at the center of the mining camp, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Wright's men were outnumbered, but they had the backing of territorial law and the confidence that came from official authority. The miners had the advantage of fighting on their own ground, but they would be challenging legal representatives of the territorial government. Wright dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and theatrical, as he prepared to assert his authority over the situation. He pulled a document from his coat pocket and held it up for all to see, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "I am David Wright, duly appointed representative of the Territorial Mining Authority," he announced. "I carry warrants for the arrest of Ruth Wood and Gary Brooks on charges of theft and conspiracy against legitimate business interests. I demand that you surrender these fugitives immediately or face charges of harboring criminals." Mitchell examined the warrant with the careful attention of a man who had dealt with legal documents before, noting the seals and signatures that gave it official weight. But his expression remained skeptical as he handed the paper back to Wright. "Fancy paper with words," he said dismissively. "But this is mining country, and we have our own ways of handling disputes. If you have charges to make, you can make them through proper channels, but you will not be taking anyone from this camp by force." Wright's face flushed with anger at the casual dismissal of his authority, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon before he caught himself. He was accustomed to intimidating people through the mere display of official documents, and Mitchell's defiance was clearly not something he had anticipated. "You are obstructing justice," Wright said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I have the authority to arrest anyone who interferes with my lawful duties, and I will not hesitate to use that authority if you continue to defy me." But Mitchell was unmoved by the threat, his own hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "Your authority ends where my property begins," he replied calmly, "and anyone who wants to test that principle is welcome to try. The standoff stretched taut as both sides weighed their options and calculated the potential costs of violence. Ruth found herself caught between gratitude for the protection the miners were offering and guilt over the danger her presence was creating for innocent people. Once again, her troubles were threatening to engulf others in violence and conflict. Gary seemed to sense her internal struggle, his voice cutting through the tension with quiet authority. "Perhaps there is another way to resolve this dispute," he said, stepping forward to address both Wright and Mitchell. "Miss Wood and I are willing to discuss the charges against us, but only if we can do so without the threat of immediate arrest or violence." Wright studied Gary with calculating eyes, recognizing an opportunity to achieve his goals without the messy complications of a gunfight with armed miners. But Ruth could see the trap he was setting, the false promise of negotiation that would end with her in chains regardless of what was said or agreed upon. "What do you propose?" Wright asked, his tone suggesting he was willing to listen while his eyes promised that any agreement would be on his terms alone. Gary gestured toward one of the larger buildings in the camp, its interior spacious enough to accommodate representatives from both sides. "A formal hearing," he said. "You present your charges, we present our defense, and Mr. Mitchell serves as an impartial judge. If the evidence supports your claims, Miss Wood will submit to arrest. If not, you withdraw your men and leave us in peace." The proposal caught Wright off guard, clearly not what he had expected from people he considered to be desperate fugitives. But it also presented him with an opportunity to achieve his goals through legal means rather than force, which would avoid the complications that would arise from a violent confrontation with armed miners. Mitchell nodded his approval of the suggestion, recognizing it as a way to resolve the situation without bloodshed while maintaining the principle that outside authorities could not simply impose their will on his territory. "I agree to serve as judge," he said formally, "but I warn all parties that I will base my decision on facts and evidence, not on fancy legal language or territorial politics. Justice in mining country is simple and direct, and that is how this hearing will be conducted." Ruth felt a mixture of hope and fear as the two sides began moving toward the building where her fate would be decided. The hearing represented a chance to expose Wright's lies and fabricated charges, but it also put her directly in the hands of a man who had shown he would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. But she had come too far and endured too much to back down now. The woman who had fled the settlement weeks ago would have been terrified by the prospect of facing her accusers in a formal proceeding. The woman she had become was ready to fight for her freedom and her dignity, regardless of the odds against her. The interior of the building was spartanly furnished, but adequate for the purpose at hand. Mitchell took his place at a rough table that would serve as the judge's bench, while Wright and his men arranged themselves on one side of the room and Ruth and Gary on the other. The miners who had followed them inside served as an informal jury, their presence ensuring that any decision would have to be acceptable to the local community. Wright began his presentation with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the advantages, producing documents and testimony that painted Ruth as a thief who had stolen valuable property from legitimate business interests. His case was well prepared and professionally presented, designed to convince anyone who did not look too closely at the underlying facts. But as he spoke, Ruth began to see the weaknesses in his argument, the gaps and inconsistencies that revealed the fabricated nature of his charges. The property he claimed she had stolen was mineral rights that she had never legally possessed, and the contracts he cited as evidence had been altered after the fact to support his version of events. When Wright finished his presentation, Mitchell turned to Ruth and Gary with an expression that suggested he had already formed some opinions about the credibility of the charges against them. "Now let us hear your side of this story," he said simply. "And remember that the truth has a way of revealing itself when people are willing to speak it plainly." Ruth stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room as she prepared to defend herself against charges that could result in her imprisonment or worse. But she also felt a calm strength that came from knowing she had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. She began by telling the simple truth about her life in the settlement, her work as a seamstress, and the circumstances that had led to her eviction and flight. She spoke of Wright's harassment, his attempts to force her to sign documents she did not understand, and his use of fabricated charges to justify pursuing her across territorial boundaries. As she spoke, Ruth could see that her words were having an impact on Mitchell and the miners who served as her jury. These were people who understood what it meant to work for a living and to be at the mercy of powerful interests that cared nothing for individual rights or dignity. But it was when she produced the original documents Wright had tried to force her to sign that the true nature of his scheme became clear. The papers were mineral rights transfers that would have given Wright's associates control over valuable deposits beneath her former property, rights that legally belonged to her as the widow of a man who had worked those mines for 20 years. Mitchell examined the documents carefully, his expression growing darker as he realized the implications of what Wright had been trying to accomplish. The mine foreman had been using his official position to steal mineral rights from vulnerable people, fabricating legal justifications for what amounted to organized theft on a massive scale. When Ruth finished her testimony, the room was silent except for the crackling of the fire in the stone hearth. Wright's face was pale with the realization that his carefully constructed case was falling apart under the scrutiny of people who understood both the law and the realities of frontier life. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful as he considered the evidence that had been presented. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who had spent years making decisions that affected the lives and livelihoods of others. "I have heard enough," he said simply. "The charges against Miss Wood are clearly fabricated, designed to cover up an attempt to steal property rights through legal manipulation and intimidation. As for Mr. Brooks, no evidence has been presented that he has committed any crime other than helping a woman in distress." Wright started to protest, but Mitchell cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. Furthermore, he continued, "I find that Mr. Wright has abused his official position to pursue personal vendettas and illegal schemes. His conduct has been a disgrace to the territorial government he claims to represent, and I will be filing a formal complaint with the appropriate authorities." The decision hit Wright like a physical blow, destroying not just his immediate plans, but potentially his entire career and reputation. But Ruth could see that the man was not prepared to accept defeat gracefully, his hand moving toward his weapon as desperation overcame whatever restraint he had maintained during the hearing. The tension in the room exploded into violence as Wright's hand closed around his pistol, his face twisted with rage and desperation as he realized that legal means would not give him what he wanted. But Gary was already moving, his own weapon clearing its holster with the fluid speed of long practice. The two shots came almost simultaneously, the sound deafening in the confined space of the building. Wright's bullet went wide, striking the wall behind Ruth as Gary's aim proved true. The mine foreman staggered backward, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers as he clutched at his shoulder. The miners moved with practiced efficiency, disarming Wright's men before they could react to their leader's desperate gambit. Ralph Ortiz found himself facing three armed men who clearly had no intention of allowing him to continue the fight, and he wisely chose to surrender rather than face the same fate as his employer. Wright slumped against the wall, his face pale with shock and pain as he realized that his pursuit had finally come to an end. The shoulder wound was serious but not life-threatening, though it would require immediate medical attention to prevent complications. Mitchell examined the wounded man with the detached professionalism of someone who had dealt with industrial accidents and mining injuries for most of his adult life. He would live, but his days of intimidating vulnerable people were over. "You will receive medical treatment," Mitchell told Wright, his voice carrying no sympathy for the man's condition. "After that, you and your men will be escorted to the territorial border and released with instructions never to return. Any attempt to continue this pursuit will be met with force that you will not survive." Wright tried to speak, perhaps to issue threats or make final demands, but the pain and shock of his wound had robbed him of coherence. He could only glare at Ruth with eyes that promised vengeance, even as his power to deliver it slipped away. Ruth felt no satisfaction in Wright's defeat, only a profound weariness that came from the realization that her ordeal was finally over. The man who had driven her from her home and pursued her across hundreds of miles of dangerous wilderness was no longer a threat to her safety or freedom. But more than that, she realized that she was no longer the same person who had fled the settlement weeks ago. The frightened woman who had sought shelter in Gary's cave had been transformed by hardship and challenge into someone stronger and more capable than she had ever imagined possible. Gary holstered his weapon and moved to her side, his weathered face showing relief that the long pursuit had finally ended without further bloodshed. But Ruth could see something else in his expression, a question that had been building between them during their shared ordeal. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying undertones that spoke of possibilities neither of them had dared to voice during their desperate flight. Ruth considered the question, thinking about the life that lay ahead of her in this remote territory far from the settlements and social conventions that had once defined her existence. She could return to her old life, could try to rebuild what Wright had destroyed and pretend that none of this had ever happened. But the truth was that she no longer wanted the safety and predictability of her former existence. The woman she had become needed something more challenging and meaningful than the narrow confines of conventional society could provide. "I suppose that depends on whether a certain mountain man still considers himself too lonely for companionship," she said, meeting Gary's eyes with a directness that would have been impossible for her former self. Gary smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features and revealing the man he had been before years of solitude had carved lines of caution around his eyes. "I think that particular mountain man has discovered that loneliness is not the virtue he once thought it was," he replied. "And I think he has learned that the right companion can make even the hardest country feel like home." Mitchell watched the exchange with the satisfied expression of a man who had witnessed justice done and seen two people find something valuable in the midst of adversity. But he also understood the practical realities of frontier life and the challenges that lay ahead for anyone choosing to make their home in such remote territory. "You are both welcome to stay in this area as long as you like," he told them. "We can always use people with your skills and determination. The mining operation provides steady work for those who want it, and there is plenty of land available for anyone interested in building something permanent." Ruth felt a surge of gratitude for the offer, recognizing it as an opportunity to start fresh in a place where her past would not define her future. But she also understood that the decision was not hers alone to make. She looked at Gary, seeing in his expression the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that she felt herself. They had been thrown together by circumstances beyond their control, had survived dangers that would have broken many people, and had discovered in each other qualities that complemented and strengthened their individual capabilities. But choosing to build a life together was different from simply surviving together, and both of them understood the magnitude of the decision they were contemplating. "We have time to decide," Gary said finally, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had learned not to rush important choices. "Winter is coming, and travel will be difficult until spring. That gives us months to see how we work together when we are not running for our lives." Ruth nodded her agreement, recognizing the practical wisdom in his suggestion. The intense circumstances of their flight had created a bond between them, but they needed time to discover whether that bond could survive the quieter challenges of everyday life. Over the following days, as Wright and his men were treated for their injuries and then escorted to the territorial border, Ruth and Gary began the process of establishing themselves in the mining community. The work was hard but honest, and the people were welcoming to anyone willing to contribute to the collective effort of survival in the remote wilderness. Ruth discovered that her skills as a seamstress were in high demand among the miners, who had little access to quality clothing and equipment repair. She set up a small workshop in one of the unused buildings, creating a space where she could practice her trade while contributing to the community that had given her sanctuary. Gary found employment as a guide and scout, his knowledge of the surrounding wilderness making him invaluable to mining operations that needed to establish supply routes and communication with the outside world. His years of solitary living had given him skills that were rare and valuable in frontier communities. But more importantly, they began to discover each other as people rather than simply as allies in a desperate situation. Ruth learned about Gary's past, the circumstances that had driven him to seek solitude in the mountains, and the gradual healing that had taken place during his years of self-imposed exile. Gary discovered the strength and intelligence that had always been present in Ruth but had been hidden beneath years of conventional expectations and social limitations. The woman who emerged in the freedom of frontier life was someone who could be trusted as an equal partner in any endeavor. As winter settled over the mountain valleys and the mining camp prepared for months of isolation, Ruth and Gary found themselves working together with an ease and efficiency that surprised them both. They complemented each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses, creating a partnership that was both practical and deeply satisfying. The question of their future together remained unspoken but present in every shared glance and cooperative effort. Both of them understood that what they had found was rare and valuable, but both also respected the other enough to allow the relationship to develop naturally rather than forcing premature decisions. Spring arrived in the mountain valleys with a sudden rush of warmth and life that transformed the landscape from winter's harsh beauty into something lush and welcoming. The snow melted from the lower elevations, revealing meadows filled with wildflowers and streams running clear and cold from the peaks above. Ruth stood in the doorway of the cabin she and Gary had built together during the long winter months, watching the sunrise paint the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and rose. The structure was simple but solid, designed with the practical efficiency that characterized everything they did together. Behind her, she could hear Gary moving about the interior, preparing breakfast with the same careful attention to detail that he brought to every task. Over the months they had lived together, she had come to appreciate the quiet competence with which he approached life, the way he found satisfaction in doing simple things well. Their relationship had deepened gradually through the winter, built on shared work and mutual respect, rather than dramatic declarations or passionate impulses. They had learned to trust each other completely, to communicate without words when necessary, and to find comfort in each other's presence during the long, dark months of isolation. But spring brought with it the possibility of change, the return of contact with the outside world as travel became feasible again. Messages had begun arriving from Andrew Sanchez and other contacts in the territory, bringing news of developments that might affect their future. Wright had been stripped of his official position and faced criminal charges for his abuse of authority and illegal schemes. The territorial government, embarrassed by the scandal, had implemented new oversight procedures designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. Ruth's property rights had been restored, and she was entitled to compensation for the losses she had suffered. But the news also brought an offer that forced both Ruth and Gary to confront decisions they had been avoiding through the winter months. The territorial government, seeking to make amends for Wright's actions, had offered Ruth a position as an inspector, charged with investigating complaints about official misconduct. The job would provide financial security and the opportunity to help others who might face similar persecution. But it would also require her to leave the mountain community that had become her home and return to the world of settlements and social conventions that she had gladly left behind. Gary read the official letter over her shoulder, his expression thoughtful as he considered the implications of the offer. It was an opportunity for Ruth to use her experience and intelligence in service of a cause that mattered, but it would also mean the end of the life they had built together in the mountains. "It is a good offer," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral, despite the emotions Ruth could sense beneath the surface. "You would be helping people who need someone to stand up for them against corrupt officials. It is important work, work that you are uniquely qualified to do." Ruth set the letter aside and turned to face him, seeing in his expression the same mixture of hope and resignation that she felt herself. They had both known that this moment would come eventually, that the outside world would intrude on the sanctuary they had created together. But she had also spent the winter months learning to trust her own judgment and to make decisions based on what she truly wanted, rather than what others expected of her. The woman who had fled Wright's persecution months ago would have felt obligated to accept any offer that provided security and respectability. The woman she had become understood that security meant nothing without happiness, and respectability was worthless if it required abandoning the things that gave life meaning. "I have a counter-proposal," she said, moving to the window where she could see the mining camp coming to life in the morning sunlight. "The territorial government wants someone to investigate official misconduct in remote areas. Who better than someone who already lives in those remote areas and understands the challenges faced by frontier communities?" Gary's expression brightened as he understood what she was suggesting. A position that would allow her to do meaningful work while remaining in the territory where they had found each other and built their life together. "It would mean traveling frequently," Ruth continued, warming to the possibilities her idea presented. "Visiting mining camps and settlements throughout the territory, investigating complaints and ensuring that officials serve the people rather than their own interests. But it would also mean having a base here, a home to return to between assignments." Gary nodded slowly, his weathered face showing the relief he felt at the prospect of not losing the partnership they had built together. It would be dangerous work, he said. Corrupt officials do not appreciate investigators, and some of the territory you would need to cover is still wild country where anything could happen. Ruth smiled at his concern, recognizing it as an expression of care rather than an attempt to discourage her from pursuing her goals. Then it is fortunate that I know someone with experience in wild country, she replied. Someone who might be interested in serving as a guide and protector for a territorial inspector who occasionally needs to visit remote locations. The suggestion hung between them, an offer of partnership that went beyond the practical considerations of work and survival to encompass something deeper and more permanent. Gary studied her face, searching for any sign that she was making the proposal out of obligation rather than genuine desire. Are you certain, he asked quietly, you could have a comfortable life in the settlements, security and respectability, and all the things that most people consider important? Are you willing to give all of that up for an uncertain future and country that most people consider the edge of civilization? Ruth moved closer to him, close enough to see the hope and vulnerability in his eyes, despite his attempt to maintain emotional distance. She had spent months learning to read the subtle expressions that revealed his thoughts and feelings, and she could see that he wanted her to stay, but would not try to influence her decision through pressure or manipulation. I have learned something about myself during these past months, she said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence that had replaced the uncertainty and fear of her former life. I am not most people, and I do not want the things that most people consider important. I want a life that has meaning and purpose, work that makes a difference, and someone to share it all with who understands what really matters. Gary reached out and took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. The gesture was simple but profound, a physical connection that symbolized the emotional bond they had forged through shared hardship and mutual respect. Then I suppose we should draft a response to the territorial government, he said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. I have a feeling they are about to get more than they bargained for when they offered you that position. Ruth laughed, the sound carrying joy and anticipation for the future they would build together. The frightened woman who had sought shelter in a mountain cave months ago was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and was not afraid to demand that the world recognize it. They spent the morning composing their response to the territorial offer, crafting a proposal that would allow Ruth to serve as an inspector while maintaining her base in the mountain territory she had come to love. It was an unconventional arrangement, but then everything about their relationship and their life together defied conventional expectations. As they worked, Ruth found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. The hardships and dangers they had faced together had stripped away everything superficial and revealed the essential qualities that made each of them who they truly were. She had discovered strength she never knew she possessed, courage that had been hidden beneath years of social conditioning, and the capacity for love that was based on respect and partnership rather than dependence or desperation. Gary had found in her someone who could share his appreciation for the honest challenges of frontier life while bringing her own unique skills and perspectives to their partnership. Together, they had created something that was greater than the sum of its parts, a relationship that enhanced and strengthened both of them while providing a foundation for whatever challenges the future might bring. The response from the territorial government arrived 3 weeks later, carried by a courier who had made the difficult journey into the mountain valleys specifically to deliver it. The official seal in formal language could not disguise the enthusiasm with which Ruth's counterproposal had been received. The territory desperately needed someone with her experience and understanding to investigate complaints from remote communities that had been largely ignored by officials based in distant settlements. Her willingness to live and work among the people she would be serving was seen as a significant advantage that would improve both the effectiveness and credibility of her investigations. More importantly, the government was willing to provide the resources and authority necessary for her to do the job properly. She would have the power to compel testimony, examine official records, and recommend criminal charges when appropriate. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work she had hoped for, with the freedom to pursue it on her own terms. Gary read the letter with satisfaction, noting the generous salary and expense allowances that would allow them to live comfortably while pursuing work that mattered to both of them. But more than the financial considerations, He was pleased to see that Ruth would have the authority and resources necessary to make a real difference in people's lives. The first assignment came with a letter, a complaint from a settlement 200 miles to the east, where a corrupt sheriff was allegedly extorting money from local businesses and intimidating anyone who tried to oppose him. It was exactly the kind of case that required someone with Ruth's combination of legal knowledge, investigative skills, and understanding of frontier communities. They began preparing for the journey immediately, gathering supplies and equipment for what would likely be a several-week assignment in unfamiliar territory. Gary studied maps and consulted with other travelers to plan a route that would be both efficient and safe, while Ruth reviewed the legal procedures and precedents that would guide her investigation. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, with a hint of snow in the air that reminded them that winter was never far away in the mountain country. The mining community gathered to see them off, offering advice and good wishes for their first official assignment as territorial inspector and guide. Thomas Mitchell shook hands with both of them, his weathered face showing pride in what they had accomplished and confidence in their ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. "You have made something good out of circumstances that would have broken lesser people," he told them. "Now go show the rest of the territory what real justice looks like when it is administered by people who understand what it means to work for a living." Ruth felt a surge of emotion at his words, recognizing them as validation of the journey that had brought her from desperate fugitive to respected official. But she also understood that the real test lay ahead, in her ability to use her new authority wisely and effectively in service of people who needed someone to stand up for their rights. The trail east led through country that was both beautiful and challenging, a landscape of forests and meadows broken by rocky canyons and swift-running streams. Gary navigated with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning to read the subtle signs that indicated direction, weather, and potential hazards. Ruth rode beside him, her mind already focused on the investigation that awaited them. She had spent the winter months studying law and procedure, preparing herself for the responsibilities that came with her new position. But she also understood that book learning would only take her so far, and that real effectiveness would come from her ability to understand people and situations. As they traveled, Gary shared his knowledge of the territory they were crossing, pointing out landmarks and explaining the history of the various communities they would encounter. His years of solitary wandering had given him insights into the character and concerns of frontier settlements that would prove invaluable in her work. But more than that, Ruth appreciated having him as a partner in this new endeavor. Their months together had taught her to trust his judgment completely, and she knew that his presence would provide both practical support and emotional stability as she faced the challenges of her new career. The settlement where they would conduct their first investigation appeared in the distance as they crested a hill overlooking a broad valley. It was larger than Ruth had expected, with perhaps 200 residents and the kind of substantial buildings that indicated a thriving community. But even from a distance, she could sense something wrong with the place. There were too few people visible in the streets for a town of this size, and those she could see moved with the furtive caution of people who were afraid of attracting unwanted attention. Gary noticed it too, his expression growing thoughtful as he studied the settlement below. "Something has these people scared," he observed. "The question is whether it is the sheriff they complained about or something else entirely." Ruth nodded her agreement, already beginning to formulate her approach to the investigation. She would need to establish her authority quickly but carefully, gaining the trust of the local population while avoiding actions that might alert corrupt officials to her presence before she was ready to confront them. They rode into the settlement in the late afternoon, their arrival drawing curious glances from the few people who were visible on the streets. Ruth could feel the weight of their attention as word spread that strangers had come to town, particularly strangers who carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to authority. The local inn provided accommodations that were adequate, if not luxurious, and the proprietor seemed relieved to have guests who could pay their bills and cause no trouble. But Ruth noticed that he was careful not to ask too many questions about their business in town, suggesting that curiosity was not always welcomed by the local authorities. That evening, as they settled into their room and prepared for the work ahead, Ruth felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness about her first official investigation. Everything she had endured and learned over the past months had led to this moment, and she was determined to prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in her. Gary seemed to sense her mood, his presence providing the calm stability that had become so important to her during their time together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew that she would not be facing them alone. The investigation would begin in the morning, and with it, the next chapter of their life together. Ruth Wood, territorial inspector, was ready to show the world what justice looked like when it was administered by someone who understood what it meant to fight for survival and dignity in an unforgiving world. But tonight she was simply Ruth, sitting beside the man who had saved her life and helped her discover who she truly was. The woman who had once been dismissed as too old and too worthless for anyone to want had found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she belonged. Outside their window, the settlement slept uneasily under stars that promised another clear day for the work of justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference in people's lives. But tonight was theirs, a moment of peace and contentment in a life that had been transformed by courage, determination, and the unexpected discovery that two lonely people could create something beautiful together. The mountain wind whispered through the valley, carrying with it the promise of adventures yet to come and the quiet satisfaction of a journey well begun. Ruth Wood had found her purpose, her partner, and her place in a world that was vast enough to hold all the dreams and possibilities that two determined people could imagine together. In the morning, they would begin the work of making that world a little more just, one investigation at a time. But for now, it was enough to know that they had found each other and built something lasting from the ashes of their former lives. The future stretched ahead of them, full of promise and purpose, and they would face it together as equal partners in every sense of the word. The story that had begun with a desperate woman seeking shelter in a mountain cave had become something far greater, a testament to the power of human resilience and the possibility of finding love and meaning in the most unlikely circumstances. Ruth and Gary had proven that it was never too late to start over, never too late to discover hidden strengths, and never too late to find the person who would make all the struggles worthwhile. Their journey together was just beginning, but they had already traveled farther than most people ever would, not in miles, but in understanding, growth, and the quiet courage that comes from facing life's challenges hand in hand with someone who truly understands what matters most.